I have been promising you a video addressing some of the new industry things that have hit us due to the NAR settlement. And the NAR settlement went into effect August 17th, so we've had a little bit of time now to sort of see how everything is going to shake out. We've got all of our new forms, so I want to review with you what you can expect due to all of the changes in the industry based on the NAR settlement. The first thing that I want you to know is that your agent is going to be asking you far earlier in the relationship to sign a buyer agency agreement, an exclusive buyer broker agreement and agency disclosure form. In Utah, we've always had to have this form signed prior to submitting an offer on behalf of a buyer. We have to have your legal written authorization in order to represent you in a transaction and act on your behalf according to your instructions. There are many agents, and sometimes it might have been me, that did not get this document signed at the beginning of the relationship with the buyer, sort of waited until we were ready to submit an offer, and then this became part of the offer docs that we would send to you. That has changed. That is different now. We have to have this agreement signed before we open a door for you, before we put you in our car. So you are going to be seeing the buyer agency agreement far earlier. So let's talk about what that buyer agency agreement does. One of the main points that I want to make to you is that we have had almost all of these elements that we're going to be talking about as requirements in Utah for decades. So a lot of the stuff that we're talking about is just sort of being emphasized. Some of this stuff is new, so stick with me and I'm going to take you through all of that. But a lot of this is going to seem a little familiar to you if you have been a buyer in Utah in the past. Okay, so first, on the exclusive buyer broker agreement and agency disclosure. Okay, the first paragraph is paragraph 1.1. This is the duration of the agreement. So it says the buyer hereby retains the company and buyer's agent to locate and negotiate for the acquisition of a property for the agreed upon duration of time below, or upon the closing of the acquisition of a property, whichever occurs first. And then there's a spot down below that says this exclusive buyer broker agreement is effective as of the date it is signed. So there's not really a beginning date in the paragraph. It's just when everybody signs it, that's the effective date. So that's the starting point. And it ends at 5 p.m. Mountain Time on, we just write in an end date. And that is a point of negotiation between you and your agent. You can set it for an hour, you can set it for a day, you can set it for a month, you can set it for 6 months, you can set it for a year. It depends on what your goals are and also what the business practices of the brokerage and the agent are that you are working with. So this is a conversation that your agent is going to have with you about how long are we working together. The second paragraph, 1.2. Properties or locations the company represents the buyer. Buyer hereby retains the company and buyer's agents to locate and negotiate for the acquisition of a property, and you can check located in a geographical area, Iron County, Washington County, wherever it is that you're located, or you can write in a specific location, specifically an address, to say, I am hiring this agent for this amount of time to show me properties in this geographical area, or I want this agent to only show me these specific properties or this specific property. So that's the main focus of paragraph 1 in this buyer agency agreement. And that's really been a part of our buyer agency agreements for a very, very long time. So that is not a change. Now there's one other piece to this. And again, this has always been sort of part of what we do. It's just been kind of broken out and put into its own little paragraph here. And it's a checkbox. The buyer does have a representation agreement with another brokerage for the following properties, and these properties are excluded from this buyer agency agreement. So if you have worked with another agent or another brokerage, this form is asking you as the buyer to disclose that and say, yes, I have an agency contract with a different agent at a different brokerage. So this gives you the opportunity to write in, yep, I'm working with that agent for these properties, I'm working with this agent for these properties or this geographical area, and also the time frame in which you are going to be working together. All right, let's get to the question that everybody is asking, the brokerage fee, paragraph 2. Okay, paragraph 2.1. buyer's obligation to pay a brokerage fee. I want you to understand this has always been a part of our buyer agency agreements. This is not new in Utah. In many states, they did not have this as a part of their documents when you were purchasing a home. So a lot of people across the country are dealing with this in a different fashion, but in Utah, we've had it for a very long time. Buyer's obligation to pay the brokerage fee. If during the initial term, which is what we just discussed in paragraph 1, the buyer or any other person acting on buyer's behalf acquires an interest in any real property, buyer agrees to pay to the company a brokerage fee in the amount of, and then it gives you the opportunity to put a dollar amount or a percentage. And each brokerage, each transaction can have its own dollar amount or its own percentage. There's never been such a thing as a standard brokerage fee. It's always been negotiated between the parties involved in the transaction. Paragraph 2.2, satisfaction of brokerage fee by a third party. Well, this says if a seller's brokerage and or the property owner or the seller is compensating the company on a property acquired by the buyer, then the compensation paid to the company by the seller's brokerage or the property owner shall satisfy the buyer's obligation for the brokerage fee shown above that we just talked about, provided that the compensation is equal to the brokerage fee. So if whatever number is in there is being paid to the buyer's brokerage by the listing brokerage or the seller, and it matches that number, the buyer's obligation is satisfied. There's nothing else that needs to happen. This is a change. This is going to be interesting how this is handled going forward. But the next line says the company, the buyer's brokerage, may not accept total compensation from any source, whether it's the seller or the listing brokerage, that is greater than the brokerage fee listed here in this document with the buyer. In the event the compensation paid by the seller's brokerage and or the property owner is less than the brokerage fee, the buyer shall pay any remaining difference at closing. That said, everything is negotiable, okay? So when you're having this conversation with your agent, talk about that paragraph, talk about that line, and what might be a remedy if that scenario happens. Okay, now what I want to do is jump to the listing agreement, because what is in that listing agreement is going to have an effect on how the offer is written by the agent on behalf of the buyer that is then presented to the seller. Let's see how some of the requirements in the NAR settlement have changed the listing agreement, so the agreement that the seller has with his or her brokerage. So I want to take you to the exclusive right to sell listing agreement and agency disclosure. And let's talk about some of these new elements here. The first thing I want to point out is in paragraph 2 of the exclusive right to sell listing agreement and agency disclosure, it's the brokerage compensation. So paragraph 2.1, seller's brokerage fee. So if during the listing period, the seller's agent, the seller, another real estate agent, or anyone else locates a party who is ready, willing, and able to buy, lease, or exchange the property the seller has negotiated with and agrees to pay the company, now this is going to be the seller's brokerage, in this case that's the company, a brokerage fee in the amount of, and you can put in a dollar figure or a percentage here, of such gross acquisition price, and that is the brokerage fee. Okay, so in paragraph 2.1, the seller and the listing agent are agreeing on the listing agent's compensation. What is the seller going to pay the listing agent to find a buyer and put that property under contract? That's kind of part 1. And the difference is in paragraph 2.2, it's kind of broken out now. So paragraph 2.2 says authorization to offer compensation to buyer's brokerage. This is a little bit different. So it says the company, and again, this is the listing brokerage, is the company in this case, is authorized to advertise or otherwise communicate that the seller and or the company is offering to pay a compensation to a buyer's brokerage in the amount up to, and again, you have the dollar amount or a percentage here of the gross acquisition price. And then, in big letters, brokerage fees are fully negotiable, and that has always been the case. Now, the interesting thing, this is one of the biggest changes from the NAR settlement, is that language here that says the company, the listing brokerage, is authorized to advertise or otherwise communicate, not through the MLS. So back in the good old days, pre-NAR settlement, what the seller was offering to pay a buyer's brokerage was disclosed in the MLS. So any agent could go in and say, okay, this seller is offering X, this other seller is offering something different. The buyer's agent would know just by looking in the MLS if the compensation being offered by the seller satisfied the agreement that the buyer's agent has with the buyer, or if there was further negotiation that was necessary. That is not the case anymore. Those fields are gone. A buyer's agent, in order to find out if or how much the seller is offering, or the listing brokerage is offering to a buyer's agent, has to communicate directly with the listing agent. So phone call or a text or email or some kind of communication, but it doesn't go through the MLS anymore. Now, paragraph 2.3 says that compensation agreement between the company and the buyer's brokerage. In the event the company, the listing brokerage, agrees in a written compensation agreement to pay a buyer's brokerage, the seller agrees that the payment amount will be added to the brokerage fee referenced in section 2.1. So historically, it's been sort of like the seller is offering a gross amount and the listing brokerage is going to split that somehow with a co-op with the buyer's agent. The new language has that separated out. So the seller is paying the listing agent a certain amount, and then possibly the seller is offering a buyer's brokerage a certain amount. Paragraph 2.3 says, if that is the case, the seller agrees that the payment amount will be added to the brokerage fee referenced in section 2.1. In that case, the seller would be paying the listing brokerage as well as the buyer's brokerage. What happens if paragraph 2.2 in this exclusive right to sell listing agreement and agency disclosure says zero? What if there is zero compensation being offered by the seller or the listing brokerage to the buyer's brokerage? Well, we've got a couple of tools available to us in our tool belt. So let's talk about what options we have available. Your buyer's agent is almost always going to go to the seller and the listing brokerage to try and satisfy the exclusive buyer broker agreement and agency disclosure fee that has been negotiated, okay? That is still the case in many transactions. So the first option we have available to us, there is a new form called the Real Estate Brokerage Payment Addendum to the real estate purchase contract. So this is an addendum that actually goes right along with the purchase contract from the buyer to the seller. Paragraph number 1 says, seller's payment to buyer's real estate brokerage. Seller agrees to pay a dollar amount or a percentage of the purchase price to the buyer's brokerage. This payment shall be made in addition to any other compensation agreed to by the seller's brokerage to buyer's brokerage. So this addendum can be used if there's a potential shortfall between what the seller was offering and what the buyer and the buyer's brokerage agreed to, or if the seller said, I'm not going to offer anything, I'm going to see what the buyer's agent is going to require or what the buyer is asking me to pay on their behalf. So this is a brand new form that buyers can use. It goes right as an addendum onto that purchase contract, just like any other addendum, where the buyer is saying, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, will you please pay my agent, pay my brokerage that is representing me a dollar amount or a percentage of the purchase price. So that will satisfy this other agreement, the buyer agency agreement. Oh, and this is kind of interesting too. It also gives instructions to the escrow or closing office to withhold the payment from the seller's proceeds. So essentially, just like a lot of times a buyer will ask a seller to pay part of their closing costs, it's just a reduction in the seller's net. this is exactly the same. So this is just going to be a reduction in the seller's net on the seller's side of the settlement statement, and that payment is going to go to the buyer's brokerage. This becomes a point of negotiation with all of the other things that we're negotiating. So if you submit a real estate purchase contract, we're negotiating all kinds of things. We're negotiating the price, we're negotiating possibly closing costs, we're negotiating sometimes repairs, we're negotiating dates. All of those things are elements of the purchase contract that we are negotiating. We're adding an element now, potentially, depending on the transaction, depending on the situation, of asking the seller to pay some or part of the buyer's brokerage fee. There's one other tool that we have. This is a real estate brokerage compensation agreement. Now, this isn't going to go on the purchase contract. This is going to be something where the buyer's brokerage sends directly to the listing brokerage. So we're negotiating that compensation, not necessarily with the seller, but now the both brokerages are kind of talking to each other and negotiating that. So at the top, instead of saying it's between the seller and the buyer, right here at the top where most of the time it does, this is saying that it is between the seller's brokerage and the buyer's brokerage in contemplation of a potential real estate transaction between, you write in the buyer's name and the seller's name here. Again, first paragraph talks about the term. How long is the term of this agreement? This agreement is effective, again, as of the date it is signed by all authorized signers, which is going to be the agents and the brokers. And then also the seller and the buyer need to authorize this too. So kind of everybody involved in the transaction is going to sign off on this. So once all of those signatures are in place, that's the start date and time of this agreement. And then you write in what is the end date, probably going to coincide with whatever the projected closing date is of the transaction that we're talking about. Okay, paragraph number 2, compensation from seller's brokerage. This agreement between the seller's brokerage and the buyer's brokerage authorizes the escrow or closing office to disperse the payment of compensation directly to the buyer's brokerage as follows. Again, there's a dollar amount or a percentage of the gross acquisition price of the property. Now, paragraph number 3 references this buyer-broker agreement. So it says the buyer's brokerage has a written buyer-broker agreement that obligates the buyer to compensate the buyer's brokerage. Buyer and buyer's brokerage agree that the buyer's obligation may be satisfied by a third party. We talked about that earlier. So paragraph number 4, we jump down and it says the seller's brokerage has a listing agreement with the seller that authorizes the seller's brokerage to offer and enter into a compensation agreement with the buyer's brokerage. There's some additional elements to what we're doing. In Utah, it hasn't changed a bunch, except that the NAR settlement was purportedly to create more transparency in the industry. In my opinion, it has caused maybe a bit more opacity because we have to ask each individual listing agent what that compensation is going to be. We've got to negotiate the buyer's agent and the buyer, what their compensation is going to be. And I will tell you that some of my buyers are frustrated by this because if you're the buyer that's got a lot of spreadsheets and you're putting in all of the numbers, what exactly are my closing costs going to be? What exactly am I going to have to come in with at closing? You might have to add a couple of pages to your spreadsheets because there could be a different amount for each listing depending on how the transaction goes with that particular seller or the listing brokerage. So I hope that provides some clarity on how the new rules work according to the NAR settlement. It isn't a ton different, but there are a few elements that are important to know. Comment below if you have any questions about the new process, and if there's any questions that I can help you with, please reach out. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.